This is the Miller philosopher. So this topic was inspired, actually, and ironically, by one of the more recent episodes of House of the Dragon, where, of course, episode 4, where they had the first dragon on dragon battle, and we witnessed the first time a dragon getting killed by falling to the earth with its rider and smashing a fortress and the surrounding land beside it. And all of this kind of inspired this particular question, which is, what is the difference between the dragons of Game of Thrones and the dragons of Middle-earth? This seems like a rather obvious question, since House of the Dragon is, if you forgive the pun, red hot right now. In fact, it's safe to say that I think when it comes to the category of giant winged reptiles, that Game of Thrones is actually more famous than Lord of the Rings, despite dragons being written into Middle-earth lore for much longer, which all book readers know. This is just the nature of visual media, putting said subject up in front of your face, so that there's little work in terms of imagining what this would actually look like. Now that it's visual media seen by everybody, that's not the case anymore. However, since they are both top franchises when it comes to the fantasy genre, which is the better depiction, and as I said before, what's the difference? After all, the number of high fantasy or sci-fi or Asian or medieval-esque stories where they have dragons in them are too numerous to count. And a dragon is a dragon is a dragon, right? Well, let's start with Game of Thrones. Now, the beasts in this series are, of course, very large, extremely dangerous, and fire breathers. Typical dragons in a way. In the lore of that universe, they are tied to magic, which a culture known as the Valyrians had mastered and used to bind themselves to dragons, so that to many foreigners, friends and allies alike, they were more or less one and the same, and they used this to create a large empire called the Valyrian Freehold. Something unique to the lore is that the dragons can be ridden into battle like battle steeds, basically. So, essentially, they become flying, napalm blasting artillery pieces that no walls are tall enough to hold back. These dragons are so notoriously untamable, though, that they may allow themselves to be ridden, but it's your life if you mistake that for submission or somehow regard the dragon as a lower status to humans. The rider and the dragons are equals. They are partners in just about every sense of the word. What's more, they're also notoriously bad-tempered. Trying to tame a dragon usually resulted in the tamer getting roasted or eaten, unless they were Valyrian. And at all times, they were handled with respect. It's a very good day if a dragon decides that it likes you. But one important aspect, and one I'm going to delve more into for both franchises actually, is going to be their intelligence, with several characters in House of the Dragon making statements to the conclusion that the beasts are smarter than they look. But again, they are still untamable and wild in nature. So, it's fair to say that dragon intelligence rates above an average wild animal, but just lower than humans. More on that later, like I said. The other important aspect being that the flying death machines are always growing larger the longer that they live. Balerion the Dread, which is the most well-known dragon to most of those book readers, was said to have been so large that it could swallow a whole horse, and that its wingspan could cover an entire village. And as their size increased, so did the heat of their flame. It makes one wonder what the old dragons of long-gone Valyria were like. Were they bigger and even stronger and hotter in flame than the dragons of early Westeros? Who knows? Now, the dragons of Middle-earth are just as complex as the dragons of Westeros and Essos, but in different ways. Dragons are said to be the creations, or genetic manipulations, depending on which interpretation you go with, of Morgoth, the fallen Valar. At one time being the strongest of the Valar, by the time of the dragon's creation, Morgoth is now much weaker, though he would have you believe otherwise. They didn't start out as numerous like Game of Thrones, but rather with one particular character, the legendary and infamous Glaurung. Now, Glaurung, as we all know, appeared in the latter stages of the First Age, and unlike his latter descendants and Game of Thrones counterparts as well, did not fly. But he was still huge, and he was still made to be a super weapon against Morgoth's enemies, who had been besieging the Dark Lord in the north of Beleriand for some 450 years or so. Though, through previous conflicts with the elves and later on men, Morgoth had arrived to the unfortunate conclusion, as far as he was concerned, that his armies of orcs, as they stood back then, stood no chance against them, nor had any hope of breaking the ring of forts, swords, and spears that dared to hem him in. That being said, once Glaurung appeared on the scene, nearly nothing was able to stop the dragon, with him only being defeated 3 times in his centuries of existence. Moreover, the later dragons of the First Stage were also reputed to be much mightier and deadlier and even more malicious than their later kin, with the possible exception of Smaug. None more so in these categories than the largest and mightiest dragon to ever live, Ancalagon the Black. I've done a video on him if you want more in detail, but suffice it to say that despite never have been seen, his reputation was so infamous that his legacy lasted far into the Third Age and oftentimes conjures images of a great dread that is so bad that one can barely conceive of it by those who were lucky enough not to have been in the War of Wrath. And for those who were there and do remember it, it sounds like it's something that they don't want to remember. So, moving forward with this, the latter dragons were noted for their intense greed, for Dwarven gold in particular, along with their war with said race, and seem to have been smaller in nearly every conceivable way when compared to their ancestors, including Smaug. And it's interesting because recent episode 4, as I mentioned before, at the beginning of the video for House of the Dragon, ends with the death fall of the dragon Meleys after being taken out by the much larger and older dragon Vhagar. And its fall and its subsequent destruction that it brings about really kind of conjured the images of what the fall of Ancalagon the Black may have been like if it's ever made to screen. Meleys' body took out a small fortress and surrounding land and armies. But Ancalagon's fall was said to have been so great that it leveled the 3 mountains of Thangorodrim itself, the most dreadful mountain range to have existed in Middle-earth lore, period. And at the heart of this is that while both interpretations represent weapons of mass destruction, Middle-earth dragons, I think anyway, have an added nuance to them in that they aren't bestial creatures running on instinct, or even partial instinct as many Game of Thrones dragons seem to be, at least part of the time. For example, Glaurung and Smaug were known to be capable of actual speech and frightening intelligence. Glaurung also apparently had mental powers that even the strongest world enemy could not fight for very long. And Smaug was smart enough to worm out information from Bilbo about what his purpose actually was and who was involved with him with conniving ease that was only matched by his later maliciousness, the latter being the trait that all dragons seem to share, period. So basically, the dragons of Middle-earth were essentially characters in and of themselves in every conceivable way except their size and power. They could talk, they were smart, none of them were good apparently, and they were known for ranging from anywhere being maliciously evil to an unfathomable degree to just being greedy and still malicious, but not as malicious or psychotic, as it were, as the dragons of old. And this does lead into one area where the Game of Thrones dragons actually have an edge over Middle-earth dragons, being that despite being bad-tempered, untamable beasts, they are also capable of affection and a strong sense of loyalty, aspects that is not at all common to Lord of the Rings dragons. It's better to say that the dragons of Game of Thrones universe are more amoral than they are evil or good. But That being said, both franchises make their dragons out to be very, very large, very tough, and with an insane amount of power. With the dragons of Middle-earth, if left unchecked, arguably becoming even more powerful than all but the most powerful Maiar during the War of Wrath, given that when Caligan and his armies of dragons appeared on the scene, they actually drove back the army of the West, which consisted of Maiar. So there you go. Whatever your preference, it goes without saying that an encounter with either one of these versions will be one that you remember in your darkest dreams for the rest of your life. Assuming, of course, they let you live. This is the Middle Philosopher, and I hope you guys have a good day.